Welcome to the SQL injection presentation for IT6873. I am your host, Aaron Hill. SQL injection is the exploitation or technique where hackers or perpetrators insert or append commands or other forms of coding in order to view, delete, or change data within a database system. Some basic examples that we might see are rendering statements to be true, utilizing 1 equals 1, or empty quotes equals empty quotes, otherwise being null values. An example here would be select field name from table name, where username equals empty single quotes and 1 equals 1, and then a couple dashes. In this particular example, we see the username field ended with a null value, and a conditional statement is added or appended through and 1 equals 1. The final single quote that's actually probably within the code itself is commented out by the double dashes. Another way of exploiting SQL injection vulnerabilities would be to append a terminating character, such as a semicolon or a forward slash. In certain database systems, it may be allowed to run multiple commands from a field, one after the other. This includes inserts, updates, deletes, or maybe even drops for whole table deletions. Some vulnerabilities that you might want to watch for are utilizing incorrect types or maybe even just improper types for field values. A numerical value could be represented as a string, but to limit the inputs, the number of string commands that can be utilized by hackers, it might be beneficial to go ahead and cast it as a numerical decimal or integer. Database servers can yield their own error messages or output that can be exploited by hackers. This may yield certain metadata such as field names, table names, or other objects that might be within a database. Any other clues or context that are given by the system can be utilized by these hackers to refine their code. Now, a website or an application might not be so forthcoming. In this case, attackers can still utilize blind injection attacks. They may not see what the results are from a distinct message that says your transaction has been successfully performed, but they may see conditional errors that may indicate, hey, this is an Oracle system or an MySQL system or SQL Server, depending on the syntax used. There are also the time delays that code takes to run. A hacker may understand that, hey, this is taking longer, maybe it's being processed by the system. It's a give and take phishing process that may or may not yield results to the hacker. SQL injection attacks may not even come from SQL alone. Cross-site scripting, malware, JavaScript, maybe even other forms of client or server-side coding can be utilized to attack the system and change the code to the infiltrator's benefit. In 2008 alone, due to hybridized attacks, over 1 million websites were compromised. Some places of concern that we might see includes the SQL code itself HTML tags, and stored procedures. The SQL code we kind of went over in the previous slides, but as far as HTML tag exploits, might include appending an additional statement to update the database, to redirect somebody to a site of your choice. Stored procedures are not immune to the SQL injection vulnerabilities either. As we can see in this statement, the use of single quotes are used heavily and can be exploited in just the same way as the 1 equals 1 or the additional um, terminating character. Some difficulties to kind of overcome uh, when dealing with SQL injection are obvious attacks and covert attacks. Some of the obvious attacks that one might see are structure deletion or denial of service, or even increased load on the system itself. These might be able to be confronted through backups or other means on an immediate level. Covert attacks are a little bit different, however, because they can be performed on the data itself in small transactions that make it difficult to determine when was this transaction performed. Has this person actually logged in anytime soon to actually determine when the attack occurred? Was it recent or was it several months ago? Let us explore some real-world examples of SQL injection in action. An executable installed via phishing emails or the network by the name of ASPROX utilizes Google to hunt down vulnerable ASP sites. By utilizing some of the examples that we showed earlier, ASPROX utilizes SQL injection attacks to redirect users to direct84.com to download JavaScript that in turn attempts to download JavaScript, ASPROC copies, Trojans, or SQL attack tools that are harmful to the system. Sony itself underwent a lot of attacks in the news over its security processes when PSN was attacked. And supposedly, SQL injection may have been used in those attacks themselves. But Sony wasn't just focused on PSN. Sony also had to deal with SQL injection attacks from SonyPictures.com and their music division servers. The hackers involved, lulsec, actually claimed that their attacks resulted from a single statement. But Sony wasn't the only domain to be hacked by SQL injection. Sun and MySQL saw attacks from TinCode and Neo that compromised their domains as well. These attacks yielded column names and email addresses within specific tables on Sun alone, and there was more metadata revealed on MySQL.com and even included some account names and passwords. Now, reports show that this was an involvement in web coding. Not even the database encoding was at fault. Our last real-world example comes from Cybervores, a group of Russian cyber criminals. They have shown that they've compromised over 400,000 servers and sites and approximately 1.2 billion usernames and passwords. Their targets are from big name companies to small websites. The cybervores actually track down their victims through search results and manage to pull from various websites. These accounts could be tracked over several years in groups. So how do you prevent SQL injection? Well, our first example includes blacklisted words or characters. In this particular scenario, that's not necessarily recommended because while it might be good for a company to disallow the use of single quotes, it might not be beneficial to users that have the last name O'Malley that actually utilize a single quote. Or perhaps Google search engines or other types of search engines where you don't want to limit user input so that people can actually search for the results. Utilizing SQL parameters is a strong technique to make sure that data is cast in the correct light, that it can be validated or classified. As we discussed earlier, error messages can reveal pertinent data about the database or servers. So redirecting to a default error message page may be in order. To kind of get a feel for what kind of sites can be hacked, there is Johnny's Google hacking database that kind of shows samples of what can be and cannot be hacked. Probably more so on the hacked side than the non-hacking side. Here are some validation samples utilizing the preventive measures in the previous slide. We can see if the field contain or the field input contains a single quote, redirect them to an error page. Otherwise, perform the action. As I said earlier, this might not be the best technique. Here's a try-catch bit of coding that verifies field data types. Now, what's inputted into the field may be a string, but if you can convert it to a specified type, such as if it's a number or a character or something pertinent to that particular field, then it can work correctly. Otherwise, catch it and redirect it to that default or generic error page we talked about earlier. Here's an example of using parameters to deal with a situation. We see the red question mark used after the where user ID equals sign. We can see after that the database .add parameter that is probably checked by now to make sure that it is a legitimate parameter. And then execute the query afterwards. Now here's some discussion questions that might need to be considered or something that we can talk about in the discussion boards. What tools or techniques can be used to determine vulnerabilities within a SQL for SQL injection? Have you had to reassess code to prevent SQL injection vulnerabilities? If so, please elaborate. Please share with us. What are some other modern cases involving SQL injection that you can talk about? You know, maybe in your own experience, or perhaps another article that you found that's interesting, by all means, bring it forward. Please take a look at some of the sites and resources that I use, perhaps as an additional reading to this presentation.